Imagine being handcuffed while someone's life depends on your hands. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the emergency wing, casting a pale glow across polished floors that reflected hurried footsteps and quiet urgency, the kind that never stopped. Not at 2 a.m., not ever, because inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, every second carried weight, every breath counted, and tonight was no different until it was, until a single moment shifted everything, until authority walked in wearing the wrong kind of certainty. Officer Daniel Hayes stepped through the automatic doors with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with judgment, the kind that decided before it understood. And across the hall, moving with calm precision, was Dr. Maya Carter, her white coat slightly creased from hours on her feet, her expression focused yet composed, a quiet authority in the way she moved, in the way nurses stepped aside without being asked, in the way her voice, even when soft, carried direction. But none of that was what Hayes saw, because what he saw was different. What he chose to see was something that didn't fit his expectation of who belonged in a place like this. The tension didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in, subtle, like a shift in temperature, like the moment before a storm, when everything feels still but something underneath is building. And then it happened. His voice cutting through the rhythm of the hospital, sharp, controlled. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from that area." And just like that, the air changed, conversation slowed, footsteps paused, eyes turned, not fully, not obviously, but enough to feel it, enough to know something was about to unfold. Maya turned, not startled, not defensive, just steady, her gaze meeting his with a calm that didn't match the situation. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her tone even, her words measured. But Hayes didn't hear confidence. He heard defiance, and to him, defiance required control. "I said step away," he repeated, louder this time, the authority in his voice now unmistakable, drawing more attention, pulling more eyes into the moment. And somewhere behind them, a monitor beeped faster, a reminder that time wasn't waiting for this, that something else mattered more, but that urgency was invisible to him, because right now, in his mind, this was the priority. This was the line being crossed. Maya exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in fear, but in something quieter, something more deliberate. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she said, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a second, there was a pause, a space where things could have shifted, where understanding could have entered, but it didn't, because Hayes stepped forward instead, reaching for her wrist, the cold click of metal echoing, louder than it should have in a place meant for healing. And just like that, everything froze, not physically, not completely, but enough that people stopped pretending not to watch, enough that whispers began to form before words did, enough that the balance of power in that hallway tilted without anyone realizing how far it was about to fall. The sound of the handcuffs did not fade. It lingered, sharp and out of place against the steady rhythm of the hospital, like something that did not belong in a room built to preserve life. And for a moment no one moved. Not the nurses, not the patients waiting in the hallway, not even the young resident standing a few feet away with a tablet frozen mid-note. Because everyone felt it, that shift, that quiet fracture in the balance of what should have been happening and what was actually unfolding. Maya did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She did not resist. Instead, she stood there with her wrists held in front of her, her breathing steady, her eyes locked forward not on Hayes but past him, as if she could already see beyond this moment, as if she understood something he did not. And that difference, that calm, only tightened his grip on control. "You are interfering with an active situation," Hayes said, his tone firm, rehearsed, the kind of authority that expected compliance without question. But the words felt thin in the air, because behind him the monitor alarm grew louder, faster, a rising signal that something critical was being missed. "Officer," a nurse finally spoke, hesitant but urgent. "We need her." But Hayes did not turn, did not acknowledge the voice, because in his mind, stepping back now would mean uncertainty, and uncertainty was not something he allowed, not in public, not in uniform. "There are protocols," he replied, almost mechanically, as if the words themselves justified the moment, as if repeating them made them true. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second, not in defeat, not in frustration, but in calculation, and when she opened them again, there was something different there, something sharper, something that carried weight without volume. "That patient in room 3 is losing time," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise not by force but by clarity. And for a second, just a second, Hayes hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the hallway where movement had begun to accelerate, where another doctor stepped in and out of the room with uncertainty written across his face, where the urgency was no longer subtle but visible, undeniable, and yet he stayed, because stepping aside now would mean admitting he had misread the situation, and pride is often louder than truth. The whispers grew, low but spreading, a ripple moving through the people gathered nearby, phones subtly lifted, eyes narrowing, judgments forming not just about Maya but about him, about the scene, about the question no one wanted to say out loud. How did this happen here? Maya shifted her weight slightly, the metal at her wrists catching the light. A small movement, controlled, deliberate. "You are not seeing the full picture," she said, and there was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just certainty, the kind that does not argue because it does not need to. And somewhere in the distance, through the glass doors at the end of the corridor, a new presence arrived, unnoticed at first, a dark vehicle pulling in, its engine cutting off with quiet precision, and inside, footsteps began to move with purpose, measured, coordinated, different from the chaos of the hospital, different from the tension in the hallway. And as those footsteps drew closer, something unseen began to shift, not in the room, not yet, but just beyond it, like the first sign of a storm that no one inside had realized was already on its way. The footsteps outside did not rush. They did not echo with panic. They moved with a controlled urgency that carried authority in every step. And inside the hallway, that difference had not yet been noticed, not by the crowd, not by the staff, and certainly not by Officer Hayes, who remained fixed in place, his attention locked on maintaining control over a situation he believed he understood, while just a few yards away, the situation itself was slipping beyond him. The monitor alarm from room 3 grew sharper now, no longer a distant signal, but a direct call, its rhythm uneven, demanding action, and the young resident inside the room looked toward the doorway again, uncertainty turning into quiet fear. Because training only carried you so far when experience was what truly mattered, and the one person who had that experience was standing just outside, restrained, watching time move in a direction no one could stop. Maya's gaze shifted slightly toward the room, not dramatically, not in panic, just a measured acknowledgement of what she already knew. "They are running out of options," she said, her voice low but precise, each word placed carefully. And this time it was not just the nurse who reacted. 2 more staff members exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them, the kind that did not need explanation, because they had seen her before, they had worked beside her, they knew what she was capable of even if they did not fully understand why she carried herself the way she did. Hayes noticed the shift, the subtle alignment of attention moving away from him, and instinctively, he tightened his stance, reinforcing his presence. "Step back," he instructed, directing his voice toward the staff now, as if widening the scope of his authority would restore order, but the words did not land the same way anymore. Because doubt had entered the room, quiet but growing, and once doubt exists, authority begins to weaken. Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him not with resistance, but with something closer to clarity, as if she was watching a moment unfold that she had already anticipated. "Officer, listen carefully," she said, and there was something different in her tone now, not louder, not sharper, but heavier. "You are focusing on the wrong problem." And for a fraction of a second, the hallway seemed to hold its breath again, because the statement did not challenge him, it reframed everything. It shifted the center of the moment from control to consequence. Behind the glass doors, the new arrivals stepped into view, 3 individuals in pressed uniforms, their movements synchronized, their presence unmistakable even from a distance, and the security guard near the entrance straightened immediately, recognition flashing across his face before he even spoke, but his voice never reached the hallway, because inside, the tension had reached its peak, the kind of tension that does not explode but stretches, thinner and thinner, waiting for the exact second it cannot hold anymore. Hayes finally glanced toward the entrance, just briefly, just enough to register that something had changed, that the atmosphere beyond the hallway did not match the one he had been controlling, and in that moment, the certainty he had been standing on shifted. Slightly beneath him, not enough to break, not yet, but enough to make him feel it, enough to make him realize that this situation might not be what he thought it was. And as his eyes returned to Maya, he saw it for the first time, not defiance, not fear, but patience, the kind of patience that does not come from waiting, but from knowing that the truth is already on its way. The shift was no longer subtle now. It had weight, it had direction, and it was moving straight toward the center of the hallway, because the moment those uniformed figures stepped through the glass doors, everything outside the immediate scene began to align with a different kind of authority, one that did not need to raise its voice to be recognized, and the security guard's posture said it all, his hand instinctively moving to open the path, his eyes fixed with a respect that could not be mistaken. Inside, however, the tension had narrowed into something fragile, something stretched to its limit, and Officer Hayes could feel it even if he did not fully understand it yet, that quiet pressure building around him, that sense that the situation was beginning to move beyond his control, and still, he held his ground, because stepping back now would mean acknowledging that he had misjudged, and that was not something he was ready to do. "Officer," one of the senior nurses said, her voice steadier this time, no longer hesitant. "We cannot wait any longer." And this time the words did not come alone. They were backed by movement, by urgency, by the visible strain on the team inside room 3, where decisions were being made without the certainty they needed, where every second felt longer than it should. Maya's eyes followed the motion briefly, then returned to Hayes. Her expression unchanged, but her presence somehow stronger, as if the closer the truth came, the less she needed to prove anything. "You still have time to correct this," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, simple and clear, and that clarity unsettled him more than resistance ever could, because resistance he knew how to handle, but certainty, without force, left no clear target. Hayes exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, his thoughts beginning to fracture between what he believed was happening and what he was starting to sense might be true, and for the first time, he looked at her differently, not fully, not completely, but enough to question the narrative he had already built in his mind. And then the footsteps reached the hallway. They did not rush in. They did not interrupt with noise. They entered with precision, 3 figures stopping just at the edge of the scene, their presence cutting through the whispers without a single word, and the effect was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence, phones lowered slightly. Even the air seemed to settle as if recognizing something had changed. Hayes turned, fully this time, his attention drawn not by instinct but by the unmistakable shift in atmosphere. And when his eyes landed on the insignia, on the posture, on the unmistakable authority carried by the man at the front, something inside him paused, just long enough for doubt to become real. The man's gaze moved across the hallway, taking in the scene in a single sweep: the restrained doctor, the gathered staff, the tension that had built itself into something visible. And then his eyes stopped, locked onto Maya. And in that moment, everything else in the room seemed to disappear, because recognition replaced observation, and purpose replaced uncertainty. Maya did not move. She did not call out. She simply met his gaze with the same calm she had held from the beginning. And for the first time since the cuffs had closed around her wrists, the balance of power shifted in a way that could not be ignored, not by the crowd, not by the staff, and not by Officer Hayes, who now stood at the center of a moment he no longer controlled, watching as the truth he had overlooked stepped fully into the light. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, the kind that settles over a room when something undeniable has just entered it. And the man at the front of the newly arrived group did not raise his voice, did not rush forward. He simply took one step closer, his presence alone enough to shift the weight of the entire hallway, his uniform marked not just by rank, but by the quiet authority that came from years of command. And when he spoke, it was calm, precise, and impossible to ignore. "Who is in charge here?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the scene in front of him, not searching, not guessing, but already assessing. Officer Hayes straightened instinctively, his training taking over even as uncertainty crept into his thoughts. "I am," he replied, his voice still firm but no longer unshaken. And for the first time, the confidence in his tone carried a trace of hesitation, a subtle shift that only someone paying close attention would notice. But it was there. The officer stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to make the hierarchy between them unmistakable, his gaze briefly flicking down to the metal around Maya's wrists before returning to Hayes. And there was no anger in his expression, no visible frustration, just a controlled focus that made the moment feel even more serious. "On what grounds?" he asked, each word deliberate, measured, leaving no room for assumption. Hayes inhaled, preparing to justify, to explain, to reassert control over a situation that now felt less certain with every passing second. "She was interfering with," he began, but the sentence did not land the way he expected, because as he spoke, the man's attention shifted, not dismissing him, but redirecting the focus to where it truly belonged. And that redirection alone was enough to break the rhythm Hayes had been holding on to. "Commander," the man said, his voice turning slightly, addressing Maya directly now, and the word did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because the effect it had was immediate, absolute, and irreversible. Conversation stopped entirely. The last remaining whispers dissolved into nothing, and even the steady beeping from the room down the hall seemed to fade into the background as the meaning of that single word settled into the space. Hayes blinked, just once, the title not fully registering at first, his mind catching up to something his instincts had already begun to question, and in that brief moment, everything he thought he understood about the situation shifted, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once. Maya did not react dramatically. She did not change her posture or her expression. She simply inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. The same calm presence she had held from the beginning now carrying a different weight, a visible authority that had been there all along but unseen, unrecognized, until now. "Why is my commanding officer restrained?" The man continued, his tone still even, still controlled, but now layered with something unmistakable. Not anger, not yet, but accountability, the kind that demanded an answer not for show, but for consequence. Hayes felt it then, fully, the shift, the collapse of the certainty he had been standing on, and for the first time since he had stepped into that hallway, he did not have an immediate response. His thoughts scrambling to reconcile the reality in front of him with the assumption he had acted on just moments ago, and behind him, the staff who had remained silent now stood with a different posture, not just watching, but witnessing the reversal of a moment that had once seemed so one-sided. Maya's voice came quietly, steady as ever. "There is still a patient who needs attention," she said, not emphasizing the title that had just been revealed, not drawing attention to the shift in power, but returning the focus to what had always mattered. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the hallway that while authority had just been redefined, purpose had never changed, and the true weight of what had happened was only beginning to unfold. For a moment, no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because the weight of what had just been revealed held them in place. And Officer Hayes felt it more than anyone, that shift from control to exposure, from certainty to consequence, the realization settling in not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable pressure tightening around every decision he had made in the last few minutes. His hands, which had acted without hesitation before, now felt heavy, uncertain, as his eyes moved from the officer in front of him back to Maya. And for the first time, he truly saw her, not as a question, not as a disruption, but as someone he had failed to understand entirely. The man standing beside her did not raise his voice, did not escalate the moment. He simply extended his hand slightly, a subtle gesture, controlled, but clear. "Remove them," he said, and the instruction was not loud. It did not need to be, because it carried authority that did not rely on volume, only on truth. Hayes hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but that hesitation spoke louder than anything else. It revealed the internal conflict, the moment where pride met reality and could no longer pretend they were the same. And then, slowly, he reached forward, the metal unlocking with a quiet click that echoed far deeper than before, not as a symbol of control this time, but as an acknowledgement of error. Maya lowered her hands calmly as the cuffs were removed, her composure unchanged, her focus already shifting away from the moment that had just unfolded and back toward the hallway, toward the patient who still waited. Because while the room had been caught in tension, time had never stopped moving. "We are out of time," she said, her voice steady. And this time, no one questioned her, no one interrupted, because the authority in her words no longer needed to be explained. It had already been revealed. She stepped forward without waiting, moving past Hayes with quiet purpose, not brushing against him, not acknowledging the moment directly, but leaving behind a silence that carried more weight than any confrontation could have. And as she entered room 3, the energy inside shifted immediately, the uncertainty replaced by direction, by clarity, by the presence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Outside, the hallway remained still for a beat longer, as if catching up to what had just happened, and Hayes stood there, his posture no longer rigid but held in place by something heavier than authority, something closer to reflection, his eyes following the doorway Maya had just passed through, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, that the moment he thought he controlled had never truly belonged to him. The officer beside him spoke again, quieter now, not as a command but as a statement. "Some mistakes carry more than one consequence." And Hayes did not respond, because he understood, not fully yet, not completely, but enough to know that what had just occurred would not end in this hallway, that the impact of his actions had already moved beyond the moment, beyond the cuffs, beyond the misunderstanding. And as the monitor inside the room steadied, its rhythm returning to something controlled, something stable, it marked not just a shift in the patient's condition, but a shift in everything else that had unfolded around it. A quiet reminder that while authority can be assumed, true power is revealed only when it is tested. And in that test, not everyone stands where they expect to. Inside room 3, the shift was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The kind of change that does not need to announce itself because everyone inside can feel it. The moment Maya stepped in, the hesitation that had filled the space moments before began to dissolve, replaced by a focused rhythm, a clarity that aligned every movement, every glance, every decision. And the young resident who had stood frozen just minutes ago now followed her lead without question, because confidence, real confidence, is something people recognize instinctively. "Give me the latest vitals," she said, her voice calm but precise, her eyes already scanning the monitors, her mind moving ahead of the numbers. And as the information came in, she processed it without pause, connecting details, adjusting direction, restoring order to a situation that had been slipping. Outside, the hallway remained quieter than before, not silent, but subdued, as if the building itself had acknowledged the correction that had taken place. And Officer Hayes still stood where he had been, though everything about his presence had changed, the rigidity replaced by something heavier, something more internal. His thoughts no longer focused on control but on consequence, replaying the moment again and again, each second now clearer than it had been when it first happened. The officer beside him did not rush him, did not pressure him. He simply stood there, a steady presence, allowing the realization to settle in fully, because understanding cannot be forced. It has to arrive on its own, and when it does, it carries more weight than any external correction ever could. Hayes finally exhaled, a slow release of tension that he had not realized he was holding, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to the doorway of room 3. And for the first time, the question in his mind was not about authority, not about protocol, but about judgment, about how quickly he had acted, how certain he had been, and how little he had truly seen. Inside the room, the monitor's rhythm stabilized further, each steady tone marking a return to balance, a quiet confirmation that the situation had shifted in the direction it needed to, and the staff moved with renewed confidence, no longer reacting, but following a clear path forward, guided by someone who had earned that trust long before this moment. Maya remained focused, her attention fully on the patient, her movements efficient, controlled, and as the tension in the room eased, there was no sign of the confrontation that had just taken place outside, No trace of frustration or distraction, only purpose, because for her, the moment had never been about proving anything. It had always been about doing what needed to be done. Back in the hallway, a few of the onlookers began to step away. The curiosity that had drawn them and now replaced by a quiet reflection, their earlier assumptions dissolving into something less certain, something more aware, and even the staff who had remained silent before now carried a different expression, one that spoke of recognition, of understanding that the situation they had witnessed was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a lesson unfolding in real time. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but meaningful, as if grounding himself in a reality that felt different from the one he had stepped into earlier. And as he stood there, watching the doorway, where everything had changed, he realized something that could not be undone, that authority without awareness is fragile, that control without understanding is temporary, and that in a place where lives are measured in seconds, the cost of being wrong is never just a moment. It is everything that moment touches. Time did not rewind. It did not pause. But it moved differently now, steadier, more controlled. And inside room 3, that change became visible in every detail. The monitor's rhythm no longer erratic. The team no longer reacting but executing with precision. Each instruction from Maya followed without hesitation, because the uncertainty that once clouded the room had been replaced by trust, and trust, once established, transforms everything. "Hold that line steady," she said, her voice even, her focus unwavering, and the resident nodded quickly, adjusting with renewed confidence, no longer second-guessing, no longer searching for direction, because direction was now clear, present, undeniable. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretched by the intensity of the moment. And then, gradually, the tension eased, not all at once, but enough for the room to breathe again, enough for shoulders to lower, for glances to shift from concern to quiet relief. And no one said it out loud, but they all understood what had just been prevented, what had almost been lost, and what had been restored in the final seconds. Maya stepped back slightly, her eyes still on the patient, ensuring stability, confirming what the monitors already suggested, and only when everything aligned, when the situation was no longer critical, did she allow herself a small pause, a brief stillness that marked the end of one moment and the beginning of another. Outside, the hallway had changed in a different way, the earlier tension replaced by something quieter, more reflective. And Officer Hayes remained where he was, though the space around him felt larger now, emptier in a way that made every thought louder, every realization sharper, and the weight of what had happened settled fully, not just as a mistake, but as something deeper, something tied to judgment, to assumption, to the ease with which he had acted without fully seeing. The officer beside him finally spoke again, his tone calm, measured. "What you do next matters more than what just happened." And the words were not a reprimand, not a command, but a truth, simple and direct, leaving no room for avoidance. Hayes nodded slightly, though the motion felt heavier than it should have, his gaze lifting once more to the doorway, waiting, not out of obligation, but because he understood that the moment was not complete yet, that there was still something left to face. When Maya stepped out, the hallway shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet recognition. Conversation stilled, movement slowed, and even those who had begun to leave paused just enough to witness the return of someone who had never needed to prove anything in the first place. She removed her gloves calmly, discarding them with practiced ease, her attention already moving forward, already beyond what had happened, because for her, the moment had passed the second the patient stabilized, and everything else was secondary. Hayes took a step forward, the movement deliberate, measured, his posture no longer rigid but grounded in something more honest. And for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding, because this was no longer about authority, it was about accountability. "Doctor," he began, then paused, correcting himself with quiet respect. "Commander," and the word carried weight now, not just as a title, but as recognition, as acknowledgement of everything he had failed to see before. And in that single moment, the hallway held its breath once more, not in tension, but in anticipation of what would follow. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not the mistake, but what comes after it, when the truth has already been revealed, and the only thing left is the choice of how to respond. For a brief moment, the hallway stood still again, not in tension this time, but in recognition, as Officer Hayes faced Maya with a clarity he had not carried before, his voice quieter now, stripped of assumption. "Commander, I was wrong." And the words did not come easily, not because they were complicated, but because they required something he had not needed just minutes earlier: humility. Maya looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that remained unchanged, as if the apology, while necessary, was not the center of the moment, because for her, the moment had never been about him. It had always been about the work, about the responsibility that came with the role she carried, whether anyone recognized it or not. "What matters," she said gently, her tone steady, "is what you do after you realize it." And there was no edge in her voice, no judgment, just a quiet truth that settled into the space between them, leaving no need for further explanation. Hayes nodded, the weight of her words landing deeper than any reprimand could have, because they did not push him down, they forced him to stand differently, to see differently, and for the first time, he understood that authority was not something you held over others. It was something you carried with awareness, with responsibility, with the discipline to question your own certainty before acting on it. Around them, the hospital slowly returned to its rhythm, footsteps resumed, voices softened back into routine. But something had shifted beneath it all, something subtle but lasting, as those who had witnessed the moment carried it with them. A quiet reminder of how quickly perception can fail and how power can be misunderstood. The officer who had arrived with the team stepped forward once more, his presence no longer introducing tension, but reinforcing order. "We will follow up on this," he said calmly, not as a threat, but as a continuation of accountability, and Hayes accepted it without resistance, because he knew now that consequences were not always loud. Sometimes they arrived in silence, in reflection, in the knowledge that a moment cannot be undone, only learned from. Maya adjusted her coat slightly, her focus already shifting forward, her role pulling her toward the next responsibility, because for her, there was always another patient, another decision, another moment where clarity mattered more than recognition. And as she began to walk past him, she paused just briefly, not long enough to hold attention, but long enough to leave something behind. "Next time," she said softly, "see the person, before the assumption." And then she continued on, her steps steady, her presence returning to the rhythm of the place where she belonged. Hayes remained where he was for a second longer, letting the moment settle fully, not resisting it, not trying to move past it too quickly, because he understood now that growth does not come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from facing them, from allowing them to change you in ways that stay. And as he finally turned to leave, the hallway no longer felt like a place he controlled, but a place he had learned from, a place where the badge he wore meant something different than it had before. And somewhere behind him, beyond the doors of room 3, the steady sound of a monitor continued, calm, consistent, a quiet reminder that while authority can fail, purpose does not. And that day, he thought he was the one holding control, but in the end, he was the one being taught what it truly meant.